All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be our last lecture exploring the transformations of realism at the end of the end of the 20th century in American literature. And now we will come to what I'm calling postmodern realism in the work of Don DeLillo. So I had previously kind of treated postmodernism and realism as opposed to each other, particularly on the grounds that postmodern fiction, because it was metafictional usually, called attention to itself as a text in a way that made it difficult to accept the story as a transparent kind of fiction, creation of a fictional world. And so we looked at Grace Paley's A Conversation with My Father, in which her father is trying to tell her, please write a realist story that doesn't call attention to itself. And she says, I can't do that because it defeats the purpose of, she doesn't say this, but it defeats the purpose of postmodernism, which was to open up the world of possibilities. And we similarly saw William H. Gass's Postmodern Manifesto, the medium of fiction, where he says that the most interesting thing about fiction is not what it's about, but the medium through which it conveys what it's about, which is words. And this makes it difficult, because one of the definitions I gave you of realism was that it has a somewhat transparent style. And so writers like Flannery O'Connor or James Baldwin in the realist tradition are trying to persuade you that the fictional world they're creating is real, so you'll engage with it as a real world and take its meanings for what they're trying to tell you. Whereas a writer like Paley or like Thomas Pynchon or like William H. Gass or like Ursula K. Le Guin are not. They're putting up the barrier of words between you and the story to make you question the way in which all of your reality is mediated through discourses and signs in line with that basic postmodern idea that we have no access to the real. So how can there be postmodern realism? Well, I think Don DeLillo's fiction gives us some ideas of how this can happen. So who is Don DeLillo? He was born in 1936 to an Italian immigrant family in the Bronx. And one of the interesting things about DeLillo is that in certain ways, if you'd look at his biography, you'd expect him to be a writer more like Philip Roth or Amy Tan, a writer coming from an immigrant background, a first-generation American, grew up speaking Italian in the household, working class, and you might expect his work to kind of reflect that in the way that the works of Philip Roth or Amy Tan or later writers will read in this course like Maxine Hong Kingston and Art Spiegelman and Jhumpa Lahiri, kind of this literature of the immigrant experience that sort of cuts across many different ethnic and religious groups, but is kind of a constant in American literature. DeLillo doesn't do that. DeLillo has that experience. He has the immigrant experience, and he writes about it occasionally in his work, but for the most part, he doesn't. For the most part, and he said the name of his first novel is Americana, and he said, I named it that because I didn't want to be an Italian-American writer. I didn't want to be an ethnic writer. I didn't want to be a Catholic writer. I wanted to write about America. And one of the lines in that novel Americana, which is I don't actually quite recommend, it's strange, but one of the lines in it, the main character, who's not from an Italian immigrant background by any means, says, I wanted to be an artist interested in the complexity of truth. And so DeLillo in a lot of ways harks back to something we saw with Elizabeth Bishop at the very beginning of the course. You remember she said they wanted to anthologize her in a collection of women's writing or female poets. And she said, no, I'm not a female poet, I'm a poet. And I think DeLillo has something of that, this kind of universalism as an aspiration. He doesn't want to write about his life or his experience. He wants to write about America as a whole. And so what he ultimately is I think a writer who's trying to record what postmodernism does to people in everyday life, what it's like to live in a postmodern society. And so that's the way that his fiction, I think, is both postmodern and realist. It treats everyday life in the same way that realism does, but its topic is how does living in a postmodern consumer society of simulacra, of people who can't have faith in grand narratives. How does this affect people's everyday lives? And he also does it in a very stylized way. He writes very stylized prose, and we'll talk more about that shortly. I haven't finished his biography, though there's not much to it. He's a very devoted writer and didn't live a very dramatic life. He attended Fordham University, so that is a Catholic university, in the 1950s, and then briefly went to work in advertising, where I think he definitely got a glimpse of post-modernity, because advertising is one of the means by which a postmodern society that's kind of imprisoned in representations of itself is created through this artificial world of advertising. But then he quit his job and becomes a novelist, and I think that's it. He's never taught. He's not a teacher. He's been married for a long time to one person. So one of our rare successful marriages in this course. No children, and I think that's basically his life. And he's kind of he's not like a fully reclusive writer in the way Pynchon is. He gives interviews and has appeared on TV and things, but he's not like a celebrity writer, even though he is one of the most rewarded and awarded writers of his generation, precisely because he is often seen as this like oracle of postmodern life. And in fact, his fiction is often said to be prophetic, that he writes about things and then they happen. So, for instance, in White Noise, we read an excerpt of his novel, White Noise, which is the novel that really put him on the map. I think his 7th novel. Or maybe his 6th, maybe his 8th. I don't know. I don't quite know. But White Noise from 1985 is about this toxic spill that happens, and this occurs just a few years before there's this devastating toxic spill that happens, I think, in India. And similarly, his 1997 novel Underworld, the cover of the hardcover novel that was published in 1997, is such an eerie image because it's the Twin Towers in Manhattan, and their upper floors are shaded in clouds that look like smoke, and there's this white bird that looks like it's going to fly right into the towers, and this is 4 or 5 years before 9/11. And so, and he gave an interview after 9/11 where people were calling him and saying, this is like something from your novels, because he often writes about one of the aspects of postmodern life he writes about is this anxiety of disaster, that we know we live in this world that's completely bounded by artificial technological representations of ourselves, and we don't have access to reality anymore. And so the only way we can imagine reality coming back in is in the form of a disaster that strikes at us explosively. And so his novels are full of violence, full of assassinations, terrorists, murders, in among the kind of comedy of everyday life in a postmodern society. So I think the way in which his fiction is postmodern is that it's an account of postmodern life. However, his style does put words in the foreground. His style is so stylized. In fact, he was close friends with the editor of Raymond Carver, Gordon Lish, and his style is somewhat similar to Lish's style, as evidenced in Carver's early stories and in Lish's own writing. It's this very terse, kind of abbreviated style that nevertheless is this kind of succession of terse sentences that begins to feel almost like it's hard to characterize, almost like a kind of mystical repetition. And DeLillo, I don't think is necessarily a religious believer, but he's often interpreted as a Catholic writer, that his Catholic background, particularly the way it exposed him, because he's growing up as a Catholic in the world where the Mass, the Catholic Mass, is still said in Latin. And he often represents language as this opaque source of revelation, not a communication system between humans that's meant to be transparent, but a sign that is mysterious and can evoke some other world outside of reality. And so DeLillo's challenge to postmodernism is almost a spiritual one, that he wants to find what is outside this world of representations and simulacra we've surrounded ourselves with in a spiritual sense. And so his writing is often concerned with these images of transcendence and spirituality, sometimes disturbingly through violence, that violence is the road out of simulation. And one of his most famous novels and one of his best novels is called Libra from 1987, and it's about the Kennedy assassination. And the hero, the protagonist of the novel, is Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of Kennedy, though in DeLillo's telling, it was mainly the CIA that killed Kennedy, which Thomas Pynchon also thinks. I think that's actually, I don't know if I should say this. I think that's actually a pretty common opinion. But anyway, but that's an interesting novel because he writes a lot about this kind of way. And another way in which he's a prophetic writer is he writes a lot about terrorism. And he writes a post 9/11 novel called Falling Man in 2007 that's about the 9/11 attacks. So he's very interested in what it is that makes particularly young men become violent. He's very interested in this alienation of young men. And I think in the few bits of his writing where he does write about his early life, I think you get the sense that he thinks this could have happened to him, that he was an alienated young man, and if he hadn't discovered literature and become a writer, perhaps he too could have been lured down this path of violence. And so his work is very haunted in that way. But he's very, unlike a lot of the writers we're talking about, he's not very polarizing. He's generally highly admired as a kind of guide to our culture. He's almost a novelist as a theorist, a novelist as a cultural theorist. And the few critics who have criticized him mainly just find his style kind of pretentious. And that can be true, that his style is kind of easily parodied. It's easy to write a parody of Don DeLillo, but I really like Don DeLillo. I'm not shy about giving my preferences in this course. Don DeLillo, sort of like Toni Morrison, these are two writers I discovered when I was teenagers, and I've been reading them all my life, and they've sort of always been with me. So they're among my all-time favorite writers. So I really like his work, and I do think that it's interesting in the way it uses language, not as meaning but as kind of significance. And they talk about that in the bio in the Norton, when White Noise, so that's his novel of 1985 that really made him a breakout star. He had been writing throughout the 70s, but it's White Noise that really elevates him. And then Libra, which was controversial because of its views on the Kennedy assassination. And then Underworld of 1997, which is his only long book. It's about 800 pages long, which is kind of his summation of the second half of the 20th century. It's a panoramic novel that takes on sort of the entirety of the Cold War. Is generally said to be his masterpiece. But when White Noise was published, DeLillo was considered a practitioner of the paranoid school of American fiction, part of a group of writers whose novels represented massive institutions or conspiracies in which characters could not hope to shape their own lives. The novel's funny, satirical picture of fragmented American family life in a leafy suburb seemed to capture what was postmodern and middle-class life, the way television seemed to generate reality, the encompassing aura of consumer culture, the morphing domestic scenes shaped by divorce, remarriage, international careers, and blended families. DeLillo's dark humor cast a critical light on middle-class achievements. The main character of White Noise is a failing professor of Hitler studies who, try as he might, cannot learn German. But for all the novel's satire and fragmentation, classic moments of transcendence and community emerge from White Noise. And that's a good summation of the novel. It's interesting that it's one of his most famous books because it's fairly atypical. It's a book where he writes about the subject matter that a writer like John Updike writes about, which he doesn't usually do. It's about kind of changing sexual mores and family life in upper middle class suburbia, which is not actually his usual subject matter, which is generally more about outsider characters. And he satirizes academia. The main character, named Jack Gladney, is a professor of quote-unquote Hitler studies, so he's satirizing the way that the traditional disciplines in academia have broken down into these kind of amoral cultural studies that no longer have a concern with passing on some tradition, but are just kind of sensationalist. And he's on his, I think in the book it's his fifth marriage to his fourth wife. So I think DeLillo is kind of satirizing the lifestyle of the upper middle class as Updike and Roth describe it. And they have, I think, four or five kids. I haven't read the novel cover to cover in a while, who are, from all different marriages. And it's written in this fragmentary style in the first person from Jack Gladney's point of view. And at the center of the novel is this disaster, what's called the Airborne toxic event, which is this leak of deadly chemicals. So the first third of the novel sort of sets up this family life and Jack Gladney's own encroaching fear of death, similar to what we saw in Updike's Separating. But the fear of death becomes real in the middle of the novel, and this airborne toxic event happens, and his family is forced to evacuate their home and go to this kind of disaster center. And what happens that you need to know for the excerpt we're reading is that Jack, the narrator, has been exposed to this toxic cloud when he had to get out of the car to pump gas when they were on their way to the evacuation center. And so that's what's happening in the section we're reading. It's a section where the family is sitting there in this evacuation center, and Jack goes over to get sort of tested because he's been exposed to this deadly chemical, and he has this encounter with this official that we're going to look at closely. And then he goes back to see his family, and his daughter is sleeping, and she says something in her sleep, and that's how the excerpt ends. So I want to look closely at a couple passages here. Before I do, though, I just want to tell you that this idea of disease, disaster, tabloids, toxic spills, this hung over the 1980s. The 1980s, as I mentioned, like the 1950s, was a period just saturated in the imagination of catastrophe, partially because of the escalating tensions of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan's desire to kind of decisively win the Cold War heightens the arms race, so you have greater nuclear fears. You also have the fear of contagion. So you have the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, which I mentioned a few weeks ago as providing some of the background for the queer movement, the LGBTQ movement that's developing in the 80s that we see in the writings of Ansel Dua, who sort of proposes queerness as an oppositional identity that gives people a greater and more nuanced and complex viewpoint on life. Well, this is in resistance to the homophobia accompanying the AIDS epidemic. And alongside that, though, is the idea of the AIDS epidemic as being the intrusion of disease into everyday life, into one's most private transactions, and that sex itself becomes deadly and dangerous with AIDS, which kind of reverses some of the optimism of the sexual revolution. Similarly, you have this fear of nuclear power and toxic leaks. So you have the sort of nuclear meltdown on 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. I once lived near 3 Mile Island in 1979. And you have this disastrous chemical leak in Bhopal, India in 1984, which is the one I had referred to earlier, which actually predates this novel. But then I think the thing this novel predicts is the Chernobyl disaster in Russia in 1986, which is another kind of nuclear meltdown. So there's this worldwide threat of toxic leaks, nuclear power plant emergencies, just this feeling that disaster in private life or in public life is around the corner. And this is exacerbated by the kind of new media of the tabloids. Tabloids were cheap and widely available sensationalist newspapers that promoted disaster, miracles, celebrity gossip. And so the title of the novel is White Noise, and the idea is white noise is this like hum that's kind of beneath your awareness, kind of like a static on an old radio. And I think DeLillo's idea is there's this constant background hum of the television, of the tabloids, and this would only increase, of course, later when you get to online living. And so we're in this culture surrounded by this constant white noise, and what it's telling us about is disaster. And so we have the tabloids are this constant motif in the novel, and particularly Jack's wife Babette is constantly reading tabloids. And we see a scene in the book, in the excerpt we're given in the Norton Anthology, where she's reading tabloids to these older people in the disaster relief center. And they're just kind of believing everything they're hearing about, the psychic phenomena and people's past lives and everything. And Jack thinks to himself, who am I to be above this? Who am I to think I'm better than this? If all grand narratives have been called into question, if we can no longer have faith in traditional religious systems, well, you got to believe in something. And this provides faith in the postmodern world. All right, so let's look at a couple passages. I want to think about Jack's encounter with the official when he goes to get tested due to his exposure to this toxic leak. And one of the things that interests me, by the way, I haven't sufficiently emphasized, this is a very funny book. I think it's very funny. Not everybody thinks it's funny. I think it's probably, my personal opinion, the funniest novel I've ever read. But other people don't find that the humor totally falls flat. It's a very peculiar form of humor. It's very understated. It's basically a very understated way of talking about things that are just completely absurd, and the mismatch between the understatement of the tone and the absurdity of the event, which is a postmodern technique, remember, the waning of affect. So the text is describing things you're supposed to have an extreme emotional reaction to, and the text registers no emotional change. And so that becomes funny. And then the other thing is the dialogue, where the characters are always talking past each other. They're never directly responding to each other. So anyway, it's a funny book. And I think, one of the moments that's funny is when Jack goes to get tested for being exposed to this. And he goes to this official and he says, I wanted this man on my side. He had access to data. And I think that that's a key moment in the novel where we see where authority now resides in postmodern culture. Because the beginning of the paragraph is, he regarded me with the grimly superior air of a combat veteran. But it's not that Jack would respect somebody who'd been in combat. It's not that you respect the military anymore, or the church, or any of these institutions. What you respect are people who have access to data, because data is what controls your life. And later on, he tells Jack that, you've been exposed to this and your health is in danger. And Jack sort of challenges him, and he says, I didn't say it. The computer did. The whole system says it. It's what we call a massive database tally. Gladney, JAK. I punch in the name, the substance, the exposure time, and then I tap into your computer history, your genetics, your personals, your medicals, your psychologicals, your police and hospitals. It comes back pulsing stars. So what we are is now, in this digital, computerized, postmodern world, we are the sum total of our data. There's no other reality to us. And so we can't even know ourselves. We have to be told what we are by the data harvesters who have compiled this composite profile of us from everything about us that can be harvested through this kind of machine intelligence. So that's what postmodern authority is then, is access to your data. And it's interesting because it's about, what are they talking about here is health. And, shouldn't health be a matter of how you feel? But he doesn't know how he feels. There's another passage in the novel where he goes to the doctor about this exposure, and the doctor says, how do you feel? And he says to the doctor, you tell me. You were totally alienated from our own experience. All we are is this external image of ourselves, not only our media representation, but the representation of ourselves in data. And note that DeLillo's writing this in the 80s, before we have a smartphone in our pocket tracking our every single move. So he's this is the way in which his book is prophetic, that he's able to see the direction this is all going to go in, that we're not going to be anything other than this compilation of data. And then similarly, he's very much on the same page as postmodern theorists like Baudrillard and Jameson, because there's a moment where he looks at the official and he sees that he's wearing an armband and it says Simovac. And he says, what does that mean? It sounds important. And the guy says it's short for Simulated Evacuation, a new state program they're still battling over funds for. And Jack says, but this evacuation isn't simulated, it's real. And the guy says, we know that, but we thought we could use it as a model. So this inability to tell what is simulated from what is real. They're in a real emergency, but they're wearing the uniforms that they'd wear if they were doing a simulated emergency, and they're going to use the real emergency as a simulation to further prepare for a real emergency, even though they're in a real emergency, which means there's no such thing as a real emergency in this worldview. So everything is simulated. Everything is a simulacrum. Everything is just a representation of itself, and the reality of experience is always elsewhere. And I think the moment in the novel that most crystallizes the consequences of this is when Jack says, and this is what I mean when I say this book is funny, but I don't know if you'll find this funny, but Jack says, am I going to die? And the official says, not as such, he said. What do you mean? Not in so many words. How many words does it take? I'm sorry, I think this is very funny. So he's asking him this very important question about the most important question you can ask. Am I going to die? And he's sort of put off with this evasion, not as such, which really doesn't make any sense. You either die or you don't. But the point here, the reason he can't tell him is because he's put in the information into this computer, and what does the computer return but a set of probabilities? And he later tells him, well, there's this much of a chance of it happening in this much of a time. So am I going to die? I can give you the computer gives you the probabilities, so we can't be sure. So this endless uncertainty that postmodern life produces, even about the most grave, no pun intended, I did intend the pun, even the most grave matters, such as one's own death. So then, that's one consequence of postmodernism. Another consequence comes out in a moment where Jack is conversing with his son, and his son makes this speech, and his son says essentially that another problem with postmodern life is we're so cut off from reality that if anything ever came along that turned off the technology that enabled us to be cut off from reality, we wouldn't be able to rebuild it, which I think is a very true and frightening thought. He says, it's like we've been flung back in time. Here we are in the Stone Age, knowing all these great things after centuries of progress, but what can we do to make life easier for the Stone Agers? Can we make a refrigerator? Can we even explain how it works? What is electricity? What is light? We experience these things every day of our lives, but what good does it do if we find ourselves hurled back in time and we can't even tell people the basic principles, much less actually make something that would improve conditions? Name one thing you could make. Could you make a simple wooden match that you could strike on a rock to make a flame? We think we're so great and modern. Moon landings, artificial hearts. But what if you were hurled into a time warp and came face to face with the ancient Greeks? The Greeks invented trigonometry. They did autopsies and dissections. What could you tell an ancient Greek that he couldn't say big deal? Could you tell him about the atom? Atom is a Greek word. The Greeks knew that the major events in the universe can't be seen by the eyes of man. It's waves, it's rays, it's particles. So I think the key moment in this passage is name one thing you could make. We rely on all of this technology, and yet could we reproduce it? Could we even reproduce the lower levels of technology? It's kind of like somebody once, I think it was my father, once said to me that, he said, your grandparents and their grandparents knew more about the world than you did. And I, I was like a kid. I was like, no, they don't, because they weren't as educated as I am, snotty remark. And he said, no, they knew more about their world than you know about your world. And he was telling me, like, the first cars would be shipped to you in a box and you'd build the car yourself. And they could, they built their own car. They could fix their own car. They could fix the stove. They could My grandmother as a child would actually kill the chicken they would eat for dinner. Go out, get the chicken, wring the chicken's neck, and then you'd pluck the chicken, and then you'd cook the chicken. They knew how their world worked. Do we know how our world works? Could we rebuild it ourselves if it were lost? And I think what DeLillo is cautioning us about, I think sometimes his work is read as kind of a celebration of postmodernism. It's not. He's critiquing this aspect of it, that we're so cut off from experience that we're very helpless. We're sort of helpless, like fetuses within this technological womb, that we're helpless to affect or recreate if something were to go wrong with it. So there's this ignorance that comes with the postmodern condition. However, DeLillo does see a way out that is not simply exiting the postmodern condition. He says that the postmodern condition provides resources in itself for its own transcendence. And it comes in this form of learning to experience things like language as routes to the transcendent, to the mystical, to the divine. So I've called this slide consumer cultus, where cultus, so it's kind of a pun. So we'd all often speak of consumer culture, but a cultus is a religious practice. And DeLillo finds the spirituality in consumer culture. And this is the place where the Norton editors end the excerpt, is probably the most famous single moment in this novel, where he goes to look at his daughter as she's sleeping, and she mumbles something in her sleep, and he hears what she said. She uttered two clearly audible words, familiar and elusive at the same time, words that seemed to have a ritual meaning, part of a verbal spell or ecstatic chant: Toyota Celica. A long moment passed before I realized this was the name of an automobile. The truth only amazed me more. The utterance was beautiful and mysterious, gold-shot with looming wonder. It was like the name of an ancient power in the sky, tablet carved in cuneiform. It made me feel that something hovered. But how could this be? A simple brand name, an ordinary car. How could these near-nonsense words, murmured in a child's restless sleep, make me sense a meaning, a presence? She was only repeating some TV voice: Toyota Corolla, Toyota Celica, Toyota Cressida, supranational names, consumer-generated, more or less universally pronounceable, part of every child's brain noise, the substatic regions too deep to probe. Whatever its source, the utterance struck me with the impact of a moment of splendid transcendence. So this is part of the novel's comic aspect, that he interprets the child's repetition of a brand name she heard in a commercial as a moment of religious transcendence. But if you read this in the context of DeLillo's other works, which of course you don't have the opportunity to do, well, you could if you wanted to, but I mean, it is possible. If you do, you see that he's often interested in these moments where what looks like this simple detritus of postmodern consumer culture, this computer-generated brand name of a global corporation, nevertheless is so mysterious that it dislocates your mind and your soul and time, and lets you see that beyond the banality of postmodern culture lies this hovering spiritual presence that we still have access to, if only we refuse to take the signs as what they are, which is some kind of attempt at communication or manipulation, and instead interpret them as these mysterious portents, these mysterious appearances that suggest something ineffable beyond human awareness that is nonetheless divine. So DeLillo, in this sense, is a traditional writer, a spiritual writer, a Catholic writer, and he's highly influenced by Flannery O'Connor, as he himself has said. Interested in how, in this postmodern shell that we're trapped in, how we can get out, not so much in a material way, not so much kind of overthrow it in a political or social sense, but just personally get out and experience something beautifully transcendent. So that's Don DeLillo, that's White Noise, and that is the end of our discussion of realism in late 20th century American writing. Thanks very much.